In the darkest week of the Icelandic winter, when daylight shrinks to a faint glow and the cold settles into the bones of the island, farmers faced a problem that should have been unsolvable. With the forests long gone and the winds strong enough to peel heat from stone, how do you keep a house warm enough to cook, work, and dry clothes, using nothing but turf, peat, and the frozen earth beneath your feet? Yet, for nearly 1,000 years, Icelandic farmers lived comfortably through winters so harsh they froze entire coastlines solid. Their homes were not primitive huts. They were engineered landscapes, turf walls as thick as a man's arm span, stone foundations that breathed moisture away, and heavy roofs that acted as giant thermal batteries. But their most ingenious invention lay hidden underground. Earth channels that carried heat from a peat fire through the walls and floors, turning frozen soil into a slow radiating heater. How did Icelandic farmers create winter homes so efficient they stayed warm through the darkest week of the year? Part 1. In the far north of the Atlantic Ocean, where the Arctic Circle brushes the edge of human habitation, lies an island of fire and ice. Iceland, discovered and settled by Norse Vikings around 874 AD, became home to a civilization that would develop one of the most ingenious and sustainable building traditions in all of human history. The first permanent settler, Ingolfur Arnarson, arrived in 874 AD and established his farm, beginning a legacy that would span over 1,000 years. By 930 AD, the settlement of Iceland was well underway, with families spreading across the island to claim land and build their homesteads. Yet the land they chose was unforgiving. The climate was harsh, the resources were scarce, and the winters were long and brutally cold. The Little Ice Age, which would grip the region from approximately 1300 to 1850, would make survival even more challenging. The initial cooling phase began around 1300 AD, with even colder conditions arriving around 1560 AD. By the mid-1780s, temperatures had dropped to about 1.5 degrees Celsius below the long-term mean, creating some of the most severe winters in recorded history. The Icelandic landscape, stripped of its birch forests by the 11th century, offered limited building materials. The forests that had once covered much of the island were quickly exhausted by the early settlers, forcing them to adapt their construction methods to the resources available. Norwegian settlers, familiar with turf construction from their homeland, recognized that the peat and turf of Iceland could be used to create structures of remarkable insulation and durability. The turf house, or torfhus, became the dominant building form, a semi-underground dwelling that would characterize Icelandic architecture for centuries. These structures, with walls up to 2 meters thick, represented a sophisticated understanding of thermal mass and insulation. The herringbone pattern of turf laying, developed over centuries of experimentation, created walls that were both structurally sound and thermally efficient. By the 12th century, turf houses were widespread across Iceland. The 13th century saw the incorporation of Iceland into the Kingdom of Norway in 1264 AD, but the building traditions remained unchanged. The 14th century brought the beginning of the Little Ice Age's worst effects, forcing Icelanders to refine their heating and construction techniques. The 15th century saw continued development of turf house design, with new innovations in thermal management. The 16th century witnessed the adaptation of turf houses to even colder conditions, with builders developing sophisticated earth channel systems for heat distribution. The challenge that faced Icelandic farmers was not merely one of construction, it was a challenge of survival itself. During the winter solstice in December, Iceland experiences a polar night where daylight is reduced to just 4 hours at the most southern latitudes, and in the far north, the sun barely rises above the horizon. The darkest week of the year, around December 21st, represents the nadir of light and warmth. The temperatures during this period can plummet to well below freezing, and the wind chill can make exposed skin frostbite in minutes. Yet the Icelandic farmers not only survived, they thrived. They developed a heating system that was so effective that it could dry clothes overnight, maintain a comfortable living temperature, and allow families to survive the darkest, coldest weeks of the year without modern fuel sources or electricity. This system was based on a combination of architectural design, thermal mass, and an ingenious use of the earth itself. The story of how they accomplished this is a story of human ingenuity, of a people who learned to read the land and work with nature to create a sanctuary of warmth in the heart of the frozen north. Part 2. The traditional Icelandic turf house was a marvel of passive thermal engineering, a structure that captured, stored, and distributed heat with remarkable efficiency. The foundation of the house was built from stone, typically one or more layers of rock that provided a stable base and allowed for drainage and ventilation beneath the floor. The wooden frame, constructed from birch or driftwood, was then erected on this stone foundation. Birch was the preferred material, but as the forests were exhausted, driftwood from Scandinavia and other northern regions was increasingly used. The frame consisted of a series of wooden posts and beams that created the structural skeleton of the house. Upon this frame, layers of turf were laid down in a careful, deliberate pattern. The turf was cut from the surrounding land in rectangular blocks, each weighing several kilograms. These blocks were then stacked on top of one another, with each layer offset from the one below, creating a herringbone pattern that provided both structural stability and thermal efficiency. The walls were typically double-stacked, with an air space between the inner and outer layers that provided additional insulate. The roof of the turf house was also covered with turf and grass, creating a thick, insulating layer that could be up to a meter thick in some cases. This massive thermal mass absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly during the night, maintaining a relatively stable interior temperature. The herringbone pattern of the turf laying was crucial to the structural integrity of the roof, as it distributed the weight evenly and prevented the turf from settling or collapsing. The roof also had a slight pitch to allow water to drain off, and in some cases, gutters made of wood or stone directed water away from the walls. The interior of the turf house was typically divided into several rooms, with the largest and most important being the badstofa, or bathing room. This was the communal living space where the family ate, worked, slept, and spent their time. It was also the warmest room in the house, as it was located closest to the heat source. The badstofa was typically rectangular in shape, with a low CE. The heating system of the turf house was based on a central hearth or fireplace, typically located in the badstofa. This hearth burned peat, a fuel source that was abundant throughout Iceland. Peat, formed from partially decomposed plant material in the boggy soils of Iceland, burned slowly and steadily, providing a consistent source of heat. The fire was kept burning throughout the winter, day and night, with family members taking turns tending to it. The smoke from the fire rose up through a small hole in the roof, called a rake which could be adjusted to control the draft and the amount of smoke that escaped. In bad weather, the hole could be closed with a sheep-gut lid stretched over a barrel ring, which allowed some smoke to escape while preventing cold air from entering. The heat from the fire radiated outward into the badstofa, warming the room directly. But the most ingenious part of the heating system was the earth channel network that ran beneath the floor and through the walls of the house. Part 3. The construction of a turf house was a monumental undertaking that required careful planning and skilled labor. The first step was to select an appropriate site, typically on a slope where water could drain away naturally. The builder would then excavate the foundation, creating a level base for the stone foundation stones. These stones were carefully selected and fitted together, creating a stable base that could support the weight of the turf walls and roof. The wooden frame was then constructed, with posts and beams fitted together using traditional joinery techniques. The frame had to be strong enough to support the weight of the turf, which could be several tons, while also being flexible enough to allow for some settling and movement. Once the frame was complete, the turf blocks were laid down, starting from the bottom and working upward. Each block was carefully positioned and pressed into place, with the herringbone pattern creating a strong, interlocking structure. The spaces between the blocks were... The challenges of building in the Icelandic climate were immense. The ground was often frozen solid, making excavation difficult. The short building season meant that construction had to be completed quickly before the autumn storms and snows arrived. The wind was a constant challenge, as it could tear away turf and damage the structure. The rain and snow could penetrate the walls if they were not properly sealed. And the weight of the turf could cause the wooden frame to sag or collapse if it was not properly designed and constructed. Yet Icelandic builders, through centuries of experience and experimentation, developed techniques that allowed them to overcome these challenges. They learned to time their construction to take advantage of the brief summer season. They developed methods of securing the turf to prevent it from being torn away by the wind. They learned to seal the walls with moss and other materials to prevent water penetration. And they developed frame designs that could support the weight of the greatest challenge of living in a turf house was maintaining it. The turf was continuously eroded by the elements, particularly by wind and rain. The grass and moss that grew on the roof could become overgrown, adding weight and potentially causing the structure to collapse. The wooden frame could rot if water penetrated the walls. The interior could become damp and moldy if ventilation was not adequate. As a result, turf houses required constant maintenance and repair. Many Icelandic farmers abandoned their turf houses each year and built new ones rather than attempting to maintain the old structure. This practice continued well into the 19th century, with some families building a new house every few years. The 1800s saw the beginning of the end for turf house construction as industrial-era technology reached Iceland. People began to sell their farms and move to towns and cities, abandoning their turf houses to be reclaimed by the earth from which they were made. By the 1900s, most turf houses had B Part 4, the earth channel heating system that ran beneath and through the turf houses of Iceland represented a sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics and heat transfer. The channels were typically constructed from stone or clay, and they were designed to carry hot air and gases from the central hearth to other parts of the house. The channels were not simply straight pipes. They were carefully designed with multiple turns and branches that maximized the surface area in contact with the surrounding turf. This allowed the heat to be absorbed by the massive thermal mass of the walls and roof, which would then slowly release the heat back into the living spaces. The most advanced earth channel systems had multiple levels of channels, with hot air from the fire rising through upper channels and cooler air sinking through lower channels, creating a natural circulation pattern. Some channels were designed to pass through the floor of the badstofa, warming it from below. Other channels ran through the walls, warming. The sophistication of these heating systems is evident in the archaeological evidence from sites like Reykholt in the Reykholtsdalur Valley in western Iceland. Excavations at Reykholt have revealed evidence of a chieftain's farm that used geothermal energy in the medieval period in a way that is unmatched by comparable finds elsewhere in Iceland. The farm had access to hot springs, and the inhabitants had constructed a system of channels that carried hot water from the springs to the house, providing heat for space heating and for heating water for bathing and cooking. This geothermal system, dating back to the medieval period, demonstrates that some Icelandic farmers had access to natural hot water sources and had developed the engineering knowledge to use them effectively. The 1200s saw the development of these sophisticated heating systems, with evidence suggesting that by the 13th century, some farms had access to geothermal energy. The 1300s brought the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which made the D. The effectiveness of the earth channel heating system is demonstrated by the fact that Icelandic farmers could dry clothes overnight in their turf houses, even during the darkest week of the year when temperatures could drop to well below freezing. The heat from the peat fire, distributed through the earth channels and absorbed by the massive thermal mass of the turf walls, created a warm, dry environment that was maintained throughout the night. The interior of the badstofa could be kept at a temperature of 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, which was warm enough to dry clothes and maintain human comfort, even when the outside temperature was 20 or more degrees below freezing. This was achieved without any mechanical heating system, without any fuel other than peat, and without any electricity or modern technology. It was achieved through a combination of careful design, understanding of thermal principles, and the use of natural materials. The herringbone pattern of the turf walls, the double-stacked construction. Part 5. The legacy of the Icelandic turf house and its earth channel heating system is a testament to human ingenuity and the power of sustainable design. These structures, built without modern technology or industrial materials, provided comfortable, warm living spaces for over 1,000 years. They represent a way of building that was in harmony with the natural environment, using local materials and renewable energy sources. They demonstrate that it is possible to live comfortably in extreme climates without relying on fossil fuels or modern technology. As the world faces the challenges of climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions, the example of the Icelandic turf house becomes increasingly relevant. The principles of passive solar design, thermal mass, and natural ventilation that were used in these structures are the same principles that modern architects and builders are now using to create energy-efficient buildings. The earth channel heating system, though primitive by modern standards, demonstrates the principle of heat distribution and storage that is used in modern radiant heating systems. The herringbone pattern of the turf walls, with its careful attention to structural integrity and thermal efficiency, demonstrates principles of construction that are still valid today. Today, many Icelandic turf houses have been preserved and restored, and they serve as museums and tourist attractions that help people understand the history and culture of Iceland. The Arbaeir Turf House in Reykjavik, which dates back to 1464 AD, or possibly 1226 AD, is part of the Arbaeir Open Air Museum, which tells the story of how Reykjavik transformed from sparse farmland to a capital city. The Arngrimsstofa, built in 1884 and rebuilt in 1983, is one of the smallest turf houses at just 5 square meters, but it demonstrates the principles of efficient design and thermal management. The Bustarfell House, built in 1770 on a site that had been settled since 1532, is one of the oldest surviving turf houses and offers visitors a glimpse into the life of Icelandic farmers in the 18th century. The Auster Medelholt, a set of 8 turf buildings on the south coast that date back to 1895, though turf houses have been on the site for the past 400 years, has been restored by its current owners and is open to visitors. These preserved turf houses are not just historical artifacts. They are living examples of a sustainable way of building that has much to teach us about how to live in harmony with our environment. The story of the Icelandic turf house is a story of adaptation, resilience, and ingenuity. It is a story of a people who faced one of the harshest climates on Earth and responded by developing building techniques and heating systems that allowed them not just to survive, but to thrive. It is a story that reminds us that the solutions to our modern challenges may not always require the latest technology or the most advanced materials. Sometimes, the best solutions are those that work with nature, that use local materials and renewable energy sources, and that have been tested and refined over centuries of use. The earth channels that warmed the turf houses of Iceland during the darkest week of the year were not just a heating system. They were a manifestation of human knowledge and understanding of the natural world. They were a demonstration of how people can live in harmony with their environment, using the resources available to them to create comfortable, sustainable homes. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, the example of the Icelandic turf house offers us a powerful reminder of what is possible when we combine careful design, sustainable materials, and a deep understanding of natural principles. The 1226 AD date, attributed to the Arbair turf house, if accurate, would make it one of the oldest continuously inhabited structures in the world. The 1464 AD date that is more firmly documented still makes it one of the oldest surviving buildings in Iceland. The 1532 AD settlement date of the Bustarfell site demonstrates the long history of human habitation in Iceland. The 1770 AD construction of the Bustarfell house shows that turf house construction continued well into the modern era. The 1884 AD construction of Arngrimsstofa demonstrates that turf houses were still being built in the late 19th century. The 1895 AD date of the current buildings at Austur Medelholt shows that turf house construction extended into the final years of the 19th century. The 1983 AD rebuilding of Arngrimsstofa marks the beginning of modern preservation efforts. The 2000 AD founding of the Icelandic Turf House Heritage Society demonstrates the ongoing commitment to preserving this important part of Iceland's cultural heritage. The future of the Icelandic turf house lies not in the past, but in the lessons it can teach us about sustainable building, efficient heating, and living in harmony with nature. These lessons are as relevant today as they were when the first turf houses were built over 1,000 years ago.